The sun rose over Rome on March 15th, just like it had done for thousands of years. The ancient city was waking up slowly. Street vendors were setting up their carts. Tourists were already lining up outside the Vatican, cameras in hand, hoping to catch a glimpse of St. Peter's Basilica in the morning light. Everything seemed ordinary. Everything seemed normal. But by noon, nothing would be the same again. Inside the Vatican walls, Pope Leo XIV had barely slept. The 71-year-old leader of the Catholic Church sat in his private chambers, staring at a leather bag on his desk. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, then pulled back. He had been going through this same motion for hours. Reach forward, pull back. Reach forward, pull back. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a physical force. His assistant knocked on the door at 8 in the morning, just like every other day. The Pope didn't answer. The assistant knocked again, a little louder this time, concern creeping into his voice. Still no answer. Finally, the door opened, but instead of inviting the assistant inside, the Pope simply handed him a folded piece of paper. Before the young priest could ask any questions, the door closed again. The assistant opened the note with shaking hands. The handwriting was unmistakable. It read simply, "I can no longer stay silent. The truth must be told, whatever the cost." Nobody knew what to make of it at first. The Pope's closest advisors gathered in a panic, passing the note between them, reading it over and over as if the words might change. Cardinal Giuseppe, who had known the Pope for over 30 years, felt his stomach drop. He had noticed something changing in his old friend over the past few weeks. The Pope had become distant, distracted. He spent hours alone in parts of the Vatican that most people didn't even know existed. Late at night, Giuseppe would find him standing at his window, looking out over St. Peter's Square with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Just 3 weeks earlier, Giuseppe had asked him directly if something was wrong. They were having their usual evening tea, a tradition they had maintained for years. The Pope had looked at him with tired eyes and said something that made no sense at the time. "What do you do when everything you've been taught to protect conflicts with everything you've been taught to value?" Giuseppe had laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of theological riddle. Now, holding that note in his hands, he realized it hadn't been a riddle at all. It had been a warning. At 11:30 in the morning, a Swiss guard stationed at the main entrance noticed something that made him freeze. Pope Leo XIII was walking toward him, not in his papal robes, not surrounded by security, not in the official car that always transported him. He was wearing nothing but a simple black cassock, the kind any ordinary priest might wear. He carried that same leather bag clutched tightly to his chest. The guard didn't know what to do. Should he stop the Pope? Could he stop the Pope? His training had covered many scenarios, but not this one. The Pope reached the gate and looked at the young guard with kind eyes. "Please step aside," he said quietly. His voice was gentle but firm. The guard's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He stepped aside. What else could he do? You don't refuse a direct request from the Pope, even when that request makes absolutely no sense. The Pope walked through the gates of Vatican City and out into the streets of Rome, just like that. No announcement, no explanation, no security detail following 10 steps behind. Just an old man in a black cassock, walking alone through the city. It took exactly 11 minutes for the first photograph to appear online. A tourist, completely unaware of who she was photographing, had snapped a picture of an interesting-looking priest walking past the Colosseum. She posted it to social media with a caption about the charm of seeing religious figures in Rome. Within 3 minutes, someone recognized the face. Within 5, the post had been shared 10,000 times. Within 11, every major news organization in the world was scrambling to confirm the impossible. The Pope had left the Vatican. The Vatican press office was in complete chaos. Phones rang constantly. Reporters shouted questions. Camera crews pushed against the gates, and inside nobody had any answers. How do you explain something you don't understand yourself? The official spokesperson stood in front of the microphones looking pale and shaken, reading from a hastily written statement that said essentially nothing. "The Holy Father has left Vatican City. We are monitoring the situation. Please remain calm." But nobody remained calm. In homes across the world, Catholics stopped what they were doing. A mother in Brazil saw the news flash across her television and dropped to her knees in prayer. A young priest in Ireland watching his phone during lunch felt his appetite disappear. An elderly nun in Vietnam who had devoted 70 years to the church began to cry without fully knowing why. Something fundamental had shifted. When the Pope walks away from the Vatican without explanation, it shakes the faith of even the most devoted believers. The Pope, meanwhile, kept walking. He moved through the narrow streets of Rome's oldest district, Trastevere, where the buildings leaned in so close their shadows touched in the middle of the day. Locals recognized him despite his simple dress. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stared, mouths open, unable to process what their eyes were seeing. An old woman selling flowers tried to give him a white lily, but he shook his head gently and kept moving. He knew exactly where he was going. Santa Maria della Luce was not a famous church. Most tourists walked right past it without a second glance. It had stood in that same spot for over 400 years. A small stone building with a wooden door that creaked when you opened it. Father Antonio had been the priest there for the past 23 years. He was in his late 70s with white hair and gentle hands that shook slightly when he held the communion cup. He was preparing for evening mass when someone knocked on the church door. He called out that it was open, not bothering to look up from the altar cloth he was arranging. Footsteps echoed in the empty church. Father Antonio turned around and nearly collapsed. Standing in the doorway, leather bag still clutched to his chest, was Pope Leo XIV. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The old priest's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Finally, the Pope broke the silence. "Father, I need sanctuary. I need a place where I can tell the truth without interruption. Will you help me?" Father Antonio had served the church his entire life. He had taken vows of obedience. He had always followed the rules, respected the hierarchy, done exactly what was expected of him. But standing there, looking at the exhaustion and determination in the Pope's eyes, he found himself nodding. "Of course, Holy Father. Of course." The Pope shook his head gently. "Just call me Leo. I think the time for titles is over." Outside, the crowd was growing. Someone had tracked the Pope's movements through social media posts and photographs. By late afternoon, hundreds of people surrounded Santa Maria della Luce. They weren't aggressive or demanding. They simply stood there, waiting, wondering what would happen next. Inside the small church, behind that old wooden door, Pope Leo XIV opened his leather bag and began to spread documents across a table. These papers, he told Father Antonio, were going to change everything, and for better or worse, there was no turning back now. The first document Pope Leo XIV pulled from his bag was so old that Father Antonio was afraid to breathe near it. The parchment had turned the color of aged honey, and the ink had faded to a dusty brown. But the words were still there, still readable if you looked carefully enough. The Pope handled it with the reverence you might give to a sleeping child, his fingers barely touching the edges. "Do you read Latin?" the Pope asked. Father Antonio nodded, though his hands were still shaking. He had studied Latin in seminary 40 years ago, but reading ancient texts was different from reciting prayers. The Pope seemed to understand his hesitation. "Don't worry. I'll translate the difficult parts, but I need you to see this with your own eyes. I need a witness who isn't part of the Vatican inner circle." The letter was dated 325 AD, written just after the Council of Nicaea. That was the famous gathering where church leaders had come together to decide some of the most fundamental beliefs of Christianity. Every Catholic schoolchild learned about it. What they didn't learn, what nobody had been taught, was what this letter revealed. A bishop named Petronius had written to his brother, also a bishop, describing what had really happened in those closed-door meetings. Father Antonio's voice cracked as he read aloud. The letter described arguments, fierce disagreements, and political maneuvering that had nothing to do with divine inspiration. Petronius wrote about how certain texts had been pushed aside not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. He wrote about how votes had been influenced by who had the emperor's favor. Most shocking of all, he wrote, "We have chosen the path that serves unity, but I fear we have left truth by the roadside." The old priest looked up from the letter, his face pale. "Where did you find this?" The Pope settled into a wooden chair that creaked under his weight. "In a section of the archives that most cardinals don't even know exists. 3 weeks ago, I was looking for something completely different. A historical record about a 13th century pope. I took a wrong turn in the archives, ended up in a corridor I'd never seen before. The doors there were older than anything else, covered in dust thick enough to write in." He paused, his eyes distant, remembering. I should have turned back. I had no authorization to be in that section, but something pulled me forward. Call it curiosity, call it God's will, call it whatever you want. I opened the first door and found myself in a room full of documents that looked like they hadn't been touched in centuries. Father Antonio spread more papers across the table. Some were letters. Others were fragments of early church texts. A few were official records with seals that had cracked with age. Each one told a story that contradicted something the church had taught for hundreds of years. One document suggested that women had served as priests in the earliest Christian communities, performing the same sacred duties as men. Another indicated that the concept of the Trinity had been debated and disputed for far longer than official history admitted. But the document that made Father Antonio's breath catch. In his throat was a journal entry from a 4th century church father. The writing was cramped and hurried as if the author had been afraid of being discovered. We have decided that certain truths are too dangerous for the common faithful. They must be protected from knowledge that might shake their simple faith. Is this deception? Perhaps, but we tell ourselves it is kindness. The Pope watched Father Antonio's face as he read. That's when I knew I couldn't keep silent. For weeks I told myself there must be a reasonable explanation. I consulted with scholars in secret, had the documents tested for authenticity. Every test came back the same. These are real. These are genuine, and they've been hidden deliberately. Night had fallen outside. The crowd around the church had grown larger, but they remained quiet, almost reverent. News vans had arrived. Their satellite dishes pointed at the sky, broadcasting to the world that the Pope was inside this small, unremarkable church. Inside, the 2 priests worked by lamplight, the Pope explaining each document while Father Antonio listened with growing horror and fascination. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. Father Antonio jumped, but the Pope remained calm as if he'd been expecting it. That will be Giuseppe, he said quietly. Cardinal Giuseppe entered slowly, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had aged years in a single day. He was dressed in his full cardinal's robes, a stark contrast to the Pope's simple black cassock. Leo, please, Giuseppe began, his voice breaking slightly. They had been friends since seminary, had studied together, prayed together, risen through the church ranks side by side. Come back to the Vatican. Whatever you've found, we can discuss it privately. There are proper channels for this kind of thing. The Pope stood up, facing his oldest friend. Proper channels? Giuseppe, these documents have been hidden for over 1,000 years through your proper channels. How many popes do you think knew about them? How many chose silence over truth? Giuseppe's eyes fell on the documents spread across the table. Even from a distance he could see how old they were. You don't understand what you're doing. The church is bigger than historical accuracy. It's about faith, about giving people something to believe in. And what happens when they find out we've been lying to them? The Pope's voice was gentle but firm. What happens to faith built on deception? Does it stand or does it crumble? The cardinal had no answer. He stood there in his red robes, looking suddenly small and uncertain. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. They're talking about declaring you mentally unfit, They're saying you've had some kind of breakdown. The Pope smiled sadly. Of course they are. It's easier than admitting the truth. Tell them whatever they need to tell themselves, Giuseppe. But I'm not coming back. Not until these documents are public. Not until the faithful have a chance to see what their church has hidden from them. Cardinal Giuseppe left without another word. Through the church's small window, Father Antonio watched him walk through the crowd, his red robes making him easy to follow. The people parted for him silently, their faces full of questions nobody could answer. The Pope returned to his documents, but Father Antonio noticed something different about him now. Despite everything, despite the weight of what he was revealing, he looked more at peace than he had when he first walked through that door. Aren't you afraid? Father Antonio asked. The Pope considered the question carefully. Terrified, he admitted, but I'm more afraid of staying silent. I'm more afraid of standing before God one day and having to explain why I protected an institution instead of the truth. They worked through the night, the Pope explaining and Father Antonio taking notes. Each document was photographed carefully. The Pope wanted copies, wanted evidence that couldn't be seized or destroyed. He knew the Vatican had resources, had ways of making things disappear, but once these images were out in the world, there would be no taking them back. As dawn broke on the second day, Father Antonio made coffee on the church's old stove. The Pope sat at the table, surrounded by centuries of hidden history. Outside, the crowd had grown to thousands. Some held candles. Others held signs supporting the Pope. A few held signs condemning him. But they all waited, sensing that something monumental was unfolding. The Pope took a sip of coffee and looked at Father Antonio. "Tomorrow I'm going to call a press conference. I'm going to show the world what I've found. There's no going back after that." Father Antonio nodded slowly. He had served the church faithfully for over 50 years. He had never questioned, never doubted, never challenged. But sitting here looking at these ancient documents, he found himself thinking that maybe questioning wasn't betrayal. Maybe, sometimes, it was the most faithful thing you could do. The third morning arrived with a sky so clear it seemed impossible that everything was falling apart. Father Antonio woke on a wooden bench in the church, his back aching from the uncomfortable sleep. The Pope was already awake, kneeling in prayer before the altar. For a moment, watching him there in the early light, Father Antonio could almost pretend everything was normal. Almost. The press conference was scheduled for noon. Word had spread through every possible channel. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras pointed down at the small church that had become the center of the Catholic world's attention. Police had set up barriers to control the growing crowd. Some estimates put the number at over 10,000 people, all pressed together in the narrow streets of Trastevere, all wanting to hear what the Pope would say. Inside the Vatican, emergency meetings had been going on for 72 hours straight. Cardinals who normally couldn't agree on what to have for lunch were united in their panic. Some wanted to send Swiss guards to forcibly retrieve the Pope. Others argued that would only make things worse, turn him into some kind of martyr. A few, the youngest ones mostly, quietly suggested that maybe they should listen to what he had to say. Those voices were quickly silenced. Cardinal Giuseppe hadn't slept since his visit to Santa Maria della Luce. He sat in his chambers, staring at his phone, watching the countdown to noon like a man watching a bomb timer tick down. He had known Leo for 40 years. They had been young priests together, full of idealism and faith. Somewhere along the way, Giuseppe had learned to compromise, to understand that running the church meant making difficult choices. But Leo had never learned that lesson. Or maybe, Giuseppe thought bitterly, maybe Leo had just never forgotten what they both used to believe. At 11:30, the Pope emerged from the church. The crowd's noise was deafening at first, then fell to complete silence. Thousands of people, and you could hear a pin drop. Cameras clicked like insects. The makeshift podium was just a simple wooden stand that Father Antonio had found in the church basement. No official Vatican seal, no elaborate decorations, just wood and a microphone. The Pope looked different in the harsh daylight. Older somehow. The past 3 days had carved new lines into his face. But his eyes were clear and steady as he looked out at the sea of people. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, forcing everyone to lean in, to listen carefully. "I can no longer stay silent." The words echoed through speakers that volunteers had set up. Around the world, over 2 billion people were watching on their screens. "For 3 weeks, I have carried a burden that has made sleep impossible and prayer difficult. I discovered something in the Vatican archives, documents that have been hidden for centuries, documents that change everything we thought we knew about our church's history." He held up the first document, protected now in a clear plastic sleeve. "This is a letter from a bishop who attended the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. In his own words, he describes how political pressure and personal ambition influenced decisions that we have been taught were divinely inspired. He writes about truths that were suppressed not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient." A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. The Pope continued, his voice gaining strength. "I have found evidence that women served as priests in the earliest Christian communities. Not as helpers, not as assistants, as full priests, performing the sacred mysteries, leading congregations. This history was erased, rewritten, buried. In a small apartment in Manila, a mother who had always dreamed of becoming a priest but was told it was impossible, began to cry. In a rectory in Dublin, a young priest who had spent years struggling with the church's teachings on gender felt something shift inside his chest. In Vatican City, an elderly cardinal threw his coffee cup against the wall. The Pope wasn't finished. "I have found documents suggesting that many of our most fundamental theological positions were not unanimous decisions reached through prayer and contemplation. They were political compromises, votes that went one way because of who had the emperor's favor, who had the most money, who could shout the loudest. He paused, looking directly into the cameras, and I have found evidence that church leaders knew they were hiding these truths. They wrote about it. They justified it by saying the common faithful needed to be protected from complicated truths. They chose what they called unity over what they knew was honesty. Father Antonio stood to the side, watching his friend speak truth to power in a way he had never seen before. The old priest thought about his own 50 years of service, all the times he had swallowed questions, all the doubts he had pushed down because questioning seemed like betrayal. He wondered how many other priests had done the same. The Pope held up another document. This is perhaps the most difficult thing I must share. There is evidence that the doctrine of papal infallibility, the belief that the Pope cannot err in matters of faith and morals, was contested even by early popes themselves. Some wrote privately that they feared it placed too much power in human hands, that it made men into something close to gods. His voice cracked slightly. I stand here as Pope, telling you that the very authority by which I hold this position may have been built on a foundation that some of my predecessors doubted. The crowd's silence had become something physical, pressing down on everyone. In homes across 6 continents, families sat frozen in front of their televisions. A grandmother in Poland clutched her rosary so tightly the beads cut into her palm. A teenager in Brazil who had been drifting away from the church found himself leaning forward, actually listening for the first time in years. A priest in Kenya sat down heavily in his chair, his prepared sermon for Sunday completely forgotten. I know what many of you are thinking, the Pope said. You're thinking that I'm destroying the church, that I'm tearing down everything you believe in. But I tell you this with complete certainty. Faith built on lies is not faith at all. It's just comfortable deception. He looked exhausted now, as if every word was costing him something. The church I love is strong enough to face its own history. If it isn't, if it can only survive through hiding the truth, then perhaps it doesn't deserve to survive at all. The Vatican's official response came within minutes. A statement was released saying that Pope Leo XIV was clearly suffering from extreme stress and exhaustion, and that his claims were being investigated by appropriate theological experts. They urged the faithful to remain calm and trust in the eternal wisdom of Holy Mother Church. But the damage was done. You can't put that kind of truth back in a box. Within an hour, protests erupted in dozens of countries. In some places, people marched in support of the Pope, carrying signs that read, "Truth Matters" and "Thank you, Leo XIV." In other places, traditionalists gathered to condemn him, calling him a heretic and a traitor. Churches became battlegrounds of opinion. Families divided at dinner tables. Lifelong friends stopped speaking to each other. A priest in Argentina stood up during Mass and announced he was leaving the priesthood. A nun in France who had served for 40 years said she was finally free to admit she had always had doubts. A bishop in Germany called for an emergency council to address the Pope's revelations. Another bishop in Italy called for the Pope to be excommunicated. The Catholic Church, that ancient institution that had survived empires and revolutions and plagues, was tearing itself apart. Back at Santa Maria della Luce, the Pope answered questions from journalists for 3 hours. He showed them photograph after photograph of the documents. He explained the historical context. He admitted freely that he might be wrong about some of his interpretations, but insisted that the documents themselves were genuine and deserved to be studied openly, not hidden away. When a reporter asked if he regretted his decision, the Pope smiled sadly. Ask me that question when I'm dying. Maybe then I'll know if I did the right thing. As evening fell, Father Antonio helped the Pope back into the church. The old building felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the weight of history itself had settled into the stones. The Pope sat down at the table where the documents still lay spread out like evidence at a trial. What happens now? Father Antonio asked. The Pope looked at his hands, weathered and spotted with age. Now we find out what the church really is. Is it an institution that protects itself at all costs? Or is it a community that seeks truth even when that truth is painful? He looked up at Father Antonio. I suppose we're about to find out together. Outside, the crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had grown larger. People held candles as darkness settled over Rome. Some were praying. Some were arguing. Some were just standing there, trying to process what they had heard. The world had changed in the space of a single afternoon, and nobody quite knew what came next. The days after the press conference felt like watching an earthquake in slow motion. The Catholic Church, that massive institution that had stood for 2,000 years, was cracking down the middle, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, like ice breaking on a frozen lake in spring. Father Antonio watched it all unfold from the small television in the church office. The news played on endless loop. Experts debated. Historians argued. Theologians took sides. But what struck him most were the ordinary people. A woman in her 60s called into a radio show, her voice shaking, saying she didn't know what to believe anymore. A young priest gave an interview saying he felt betrayed, like everything he'd sacrificed his life for might be built on sand. An elderly man in Mexico was filmed kneeling outside his local church, praying for guidance because he loved God but didn't know if he could trust the church anymore. Inside the Vatican, the emergency meetings had evolved into something closer to war councils. Cardinals who had flown in from every corner of the globe filled the conference rooms. Some hadn't left the Vatican complex in days. They survived on coffee and nervous energy, trying to figure out how to contain a crisis that couldn't be contained. Cardinal Giuseppe found himself in an impossible position. Half the cardinals wanted him to condemn his old friend publicly. The other half wanted him to act as a mediator, to convince the Pope to return and discuss things privately. He couldn't do either. Every time he thought about Leo standing at that podium, showing those ancient documents to the world, he felt something twist inside him. Was it anger, betrayal, or was it something worse, something he didn't want to name? Was it envy that his friend had found the courage to do what Giuseppe had never dared? On the 5th day after the revelation, 3 prominent historians held a joint press conference. They had examined the photographs of the documents that the Pope had released. Their conclusion was careful, measured, but devastating. The documents appeared to be authentic. The parchment, the ink, the writing style, the historical details all checked out. This wasn't some elaborate forgery. This was real history that had been locked away. The Vatican's response was to announce they were forming their own committee to examine the documents. But they also made it clear that the Pope had removed the originals without authorization, which they claimed was essentially theft. Some cardinals were already using words like mental breakdown and temporary insanity. The message was clear. They were going to discredit the messenger since they couldn't discredit the message. But the world wasn't waiting for official committees and Vatican investigations. People were making up their own minds. In the Philippines, over 3 million people attended a vigil supporting Pope Leo XIV. They filled the streets of Manila, holding candles and signs that read, "Truth is sacred and thank you, Holy Father." In Poland, an equal number gathered to condemn him, traditional hymns rising into the cold air as they prayed for the Pope to recant. Churches became divided territories. In some parishes, priests announced they stood with Pope Leo XIV and his call for transparency. In others, priests condemned him from the pulpit, calling his actions reckless and dangerous. Families stopped speaking to each other. A father in Ireland hadn't talked to his son in 3 days because one supported the Pope and one called him a heretic. A husband and wife in Argentina slept in separate rooms, the silence between them filled with everything they couldn't say about faith and doubt and what it all meant. Father Antonio noticed that the Pope had become quieter as the week progressed. He still spent hours each day with the documents, still met with the small group of scholars who had joined him at Santa Maria della Luce. But in the evenings he would sit alone in the empty church, staring at the simple altar, his lips moving in silent prayer. One night Father Antonio found him there past midnight. "Do you regret it?" the old priest asked, sitting down beside him. The Pope was quiet for a long time. "Every single day," he finally said. "I see what it's doing to people. The confusion, the pain, the anger. I see families torn apart. I see faith shaken. How could I not regret that?" He turned to look at Father Antonio, and in the dim light his face looked ancient. "But then I think about what it would mean to have stayed silent. To have let those documents remain hidden. To have died knowing I had protected an institution instead of the truth. And I regret that even more." The next morning brought news that changed everything. A cardinal from Brazil, a man known for his conservative views and his loyalty to traditional church teachings, released a statement. He said that while he disagreed with the Pope's methods, He believed the documents deserved serious examination. More importantly, he called for an ecumenical council, a gathering of church leaders from around the world to openly discuss what these documents meant for the church's future. Within hours, other cardinals began to echo the call. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. A bishop from Kenya, an archbishop from South Korea, a cardinal from Canada. Slowly, carefully, a middle path was emerging between those who wanted to condemn the Pope entirely and those who wanted to embrace his revelations without question. Cardinal Giuseppe read these statements with a mix of relief and dread. A council could work. It could provide a way forward that didn't involve tearing the church completely apart. But it would also mean admitting that there were serious questions that needed answering. It would mean acknowledging that Pope Leo XIV hadn't simply lost his mind, that what he had revealed deserved to be taken seriously. Giuseppe found himself walking to Santa Maria della Luce without consciously deciding to go. The crowds had thinned slightly, but there were still hundreds of people keeping vigil outside the church. They let him through without a word, recognizing his cardinal's robes. Inside, he found Leo exactly where he expected, at the table with the documents. "They're calling for a council," Giuseppe said without preamble. The Pope looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Who?" Giuseppe listed the names. With each one, the Pope's expression changed, moving from surprise to something that might have been hope. "You could come back," Giuseppe continued, his voice urgent now. Not as if nothing happened, but to participate in the council, to be part of finding a way forward. The Pope shook his head slowly. "I can't go back, Giuseppe. Not as Pope, don't you see? My entire position is based on the authority that these documents question. How can I sit in judgment of evidence that undermines my own legitimacy?" Giuseppe sat down heavily. "So what then? You just stay here forever? You let the church tear itself apart?" "No," the Pope said firmly. "I'm going to resign." The words hung in the air like smoke. Giuseppe felt his chest tighten. "You can't, you're the Pope. Popes don't just quit because things get difficult." The Pope smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Actually, they can. Benedict did it, and unlike him, I have a very good reason. I can't be Pope and a voice for reform at the same time. The position itself is part of what needs to be examined." Over the next 2 days, word leaked that the Pope was considering resignation. The news sent fresh shockwaves through an already reeling church. Some saw it as surrender, as the Pope admitting he had been wrong. Others saw it as the ultimate act of integrity, a man choosing principle over power. The debates raged on television, on social media, in churches and homes around the world. In a small village in Vietnam, a priest who had served for 30 years stood before his congregation and admitted he didn't have answers anymore. He asked them to pray with him, not for certainty, but for wisdom to accept uncertainty. In Boston, a theology professor told her students that they were witnessing the most important moment in church history since the Reformation. In Rome, an elderly nun who had lived through 3 popes found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, the church needed to be shaken this hard. Father Antonio prepared for what would be the Pope's final official act. As he arranged the simple altar where Leo would make his announcement, he thought about his own 50 years of service. All those years of accepting what he was told, of trusting that the church leaders knew best. He wasn't angry about it exactly, but he understood now that blind trust and real faith weren't the same thing. Maybe, he thought, that was the real revelation, not the documents themselves, but the understanding that questioning wasn't betrayal, that seeking truth, even painful truth, was its own form of devotion. The Pope spent his last night in Santa Maria della Luce writing, not a justification or a defense, but a letter to the faithful, a letter explaining why he had to step down, why the church needed to face its history honestly, why truth mattered even when it hurt. As dawn broke on what would be his final day as Pope, he sealed the letter and placed it on the altar. Tomorrow he would read it to the world. Tomorrow he would stop being Pope Leo XIV and return to being just a man named Marco, a man who had chosen conscience over comfort and truth over tradition. Whether history would call him brave or foolish, he couldn't know. But he would be able to face himself in the mirror, and in the end, perhaps that was enough. The morning of the resignation arrived with unexpected quiet. The crowds outside Santa Maria della Luce had grown so large that the narrow streets of Trastevere could barely contain them. But instead of the chaos and shouting of previous days, there was a strange calm. People stood shoulder to shoulder waiting, understanding that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for centuries. Pope Leo XIV woke before dawn. Father Antonio found him already dressed in his simple black cassock, sitting at the table where the documents still lay. The leather bag that had started everything sat empty beside them. "Are you ready?" Father Antonio asked. The Pope looked at him with tired eyes. "No, but I don't think you can ever really be ready for something like this." Inside the Vatican, Cardinal Giuseppe sat in his chambers watching the live news coverage. He had been awake all night, going over everything in his mind. Part of him still wanted to stop this, to find some way to convince his old friend to reconsider. But another part, a part he was only beginning to acknowledge, understood that Leo was doing what Giuseppe had never been brave enough to do. He was choosing truth even when it cost him everything. At 9 in the morning, the Pope emerged from the church. The crowd fell silent so completely that you could hear the pigeons on the nearby rooftops. Camera crews from every major network were positioned at every angle. Historians stood ready to record every word. This would be studied in seminaries and universities for generations. But in that moment, it was just an old man standing at a simple wooden podium, about to give up the most powerful position in one of the world's oldest institutions. 3 weeks ago, the Pope began, his voice steady despite everything. "I discovered documents that changed everything I thought I knew about the church I have served my entire life. I could have stayed silent. Many people have told me I should have stayed silent, but silence, I have learned, is its own kind of lie." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I have spent these past weeks being called many things: heretic, traitor, madman. Some have said I'm destroying the church. Others have said I'm saving it. The truth is, I'm just a man who found something he couldn't ignore and made a choice that seemed impossible not to make." The Pope held up a simple piece of paper. "This is my formal resignation from the papacy. Effective immediately, I am no longer Pope Leo XIV. I return to my birth name, Marco Pellegrini. Just Marco. Just a man who tried to do what he thought was right." A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through trees. Some people began to cry. Others looked stunned, as if they hadn't quite believed it would really happen. In homes around the world, families gathered around televisions fell silent. A mother in Chile held her daughter's hand. A priest in Canada closed his eyes. A teenager in Japan who had never cared much about religion found herself unexpectedly moved. "I want to be clear about something," Marco continued, and his voice was stronger now. "I am not recanting. I am not saying I was wrong. I stand by every document I revealed. I stand by my belief that the faithful deserve to know the full truth of church history, not a sanitized version designed to make them more obedient." He looked directly into the cameras, "But I also recognize that I cannot be pope while challenging the very foundations of papal authority. That would be hypocrisy of the highest order." He pulled something from his pocket. Even from a distance, people could see what it was: the fisherman's ring, the symbol of papal authority that every pope wears. Marco held it up so everyone could see it, then placed it carefully on the podium. "I call upon the College of Cardinals to convene an ecumenical council, not to condemn me, not to hide what I've found, but to honestly examine these documents and have open conversations about what they mean for the Church's future." The words hung in the air. An ecumenical council. The last one had been in the 1960s. They were rare, massive undertakings that brought together church leaders from every corner of the globe. But they were also how the church had always navigated its biggest crises. Marco was essentially saying, take this seriously, examine it properly, let the whole church be part of deciding what it means. "The church I love is strong enough to face its own history," Marco said, and his voice cracked slightly. "If it is not, if it can only survive by hiding uncomfortable truths, then perhaps it is not the church Christ intended it to be." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I will remain here at Santa Maria della Luce, serving as a simple priest available to anyone who wants to examine the documents or discuss what they might mean. I am not running away. I am not hiding. I am simply stepping aside from a position that I can no longer hold with integrity." Father Antonio stood beside the podium, watching his friend, his pope, become just a man in a black cassock. He thought about all the priests throughout history who had faced similar moments, who had to choose between comfort and conscience. He wondered how many had chosen silence. He was grateful that Marco had chosen differently. The questions from journalists came rapid fire. Did Marco regret his decision? Would he accept the results of the council even if they disagreed with his interpretations? Did he think he would be excommunicated? Marco answered each one carefully, honestly. No, he didn't regret it, though he grieved for the pain it had caused. Yes, he would accept the council's findings because he believed in collective wisdom over individual certainty. And as for excommunication, he said with a sad smile, that was up to others to decide. He had made his peace with whatever consequences came. In the Vatican, the response was swift but more measured than before. A statement was released within an hour. The Holy See acknowledged the resignation, thanked Pope Leo XIV for his years of service, and announced that preparations for a conclave to elect a new pope would begin. But buried in the middle of the statement was a single sentence that sent ripples through everyone who read it carefully. The College of Cardinals will consider the proposal for an ecumenical council to examine questions of historical transparency and church governance. They were going to do it. They were actually going to convene the council. Cardinal Giuseppe read that sentence 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. It wasn't a promise, just a consideration, but it was more than he had expected. Maybe, he thought, maybe there was a path forward after all. The weeks that followed were strange and uncertain. Marco remained at Santa Maria della Luce, true to his word. Scholars came from universities around the world to examine the documents in person. Some confirmed his interpretations. Others disputed them. All agreed the documents were genuine pieces of church history that deserved serious study. Debate raged in academic journals, in church basements, in seminary classrooms. It was messy and complicated and sometimes angry, but it was happening in the open, which was something new. The conclave to elect a new pope was delayed as cardinals grappled with Marco's revelations. How do you choose a new leader when the very nature of leadership is being questioned? The discussions went on for months. Conservative cardinals argued for someone who would restore traditional authority. Progressive cardinals pushed for someone who would embrace reform. And slowly, painfully, a middle path emerged. The man they finally elected was younger than expected, a cardinal from South America who had spent years working with the poor. In his first address, he announced that yes, there would be an ecumenical council. It would begin in a year, giving time for preparation and prayer. It would examine the documents Marco had revealed. More importantly, it would look at how the church could be more transparent, more honest about its history, more open to questions and doubt. Marco watched the announcement on Father Antonio's small television. The new pope had chosen the name Peter II, the first pope to take the name of the first apostle since the very beginning. It was a statement. We're going back to foundations, back to basics, back to asking what this church is really supposed to be. Do you think it will work? Father Antonio asked. Marco was quiet for a long time. I don't know. Maybe they'll just find a way to explain away everything I found. Maybe they'll conclude that protecting people's faith matters more than historical accuracy. Or maybe, just maybe, they'll decide that faith strong enough to face the truth is faith worth having. A year later, the Ecumenical Council began. Over 2,000 church leaders gathered in Rome. Marco was invited to present his findings, which he did over 3 days of testimony. The debates that followed were intense, sometimes angry, but always public. News cameras were allowed in for the first time in church history. The world watched as the Catholic Church wrestled with its own past. The conclusions, when they finally came, satisfied no one completely. Some documents were confirmed as authentic challenges to traditional teachings. Others were deemed less significant than Marco had believed. The Church officially apologized for hiding historical records and committed to opening most of its archives to scholars. Women's roles in the early Church were acknowledged more fully, though the question of female priests was left for future discussion. Papal infallibility was reaffirmed, but with more nuance and limitations than before. Marco, now simply Father Marco to everyone, accepted it all with grace. He hadn't expected complete transformation overnight. Change in an institution 2,000 years old happened slowly, in inches rather than miles. What mattered was that the conversation was happening, that questions were being asked, that history was being examined honestly. 5 years after that morning when he walked out of the Vatican with a leather bag full of secrets, Father Marco still served at Santa Maria della Luce. The church had become something of a pilgrimage site for people seeking honest conversations about faith and doubt. He spent his days teaching, writing, and meeting with anyone who wanted to discuss the complex relationship between truth and tradition. On quiet evenings, Father Antonio would join him in the empty church. They rarely talked about those tumultuous weeks anymore, but sometimes when the light fell just right through the old windows, Marco would look around at the simple stone walls and wooden benches and smile. "Do you think it was worth it?" Father Antonio asked once. Marco thought about all that had been lost and all that had been gained. He thought about families torn apart and faith shaken. He also thought about honest conversations happening in churches worldwide, about historical documents no longer hidden, about a church learning slowly to face uncomfortable truths. "Ask me on my deathbed," he finally said, the same answer he had given years before. But this time he was smiling, though I suspect I already know what I'll say.